Good evening and welcome. I'm Wendy Brennan and I cover older adult issues for State Senator Liz Krueger. It's budget season in Albany and Senator Krueger is meeting with our colleagues tonight to discuss the budget and is sorry that she couldn't be with you this evening. And I want to welcome everybody who's attending this event on Zoom, on Facebook Live, or participating by phone. This is the third session of our Senior Roundtable series, Living Well, Age-Friendly Housing. And this evening's program is going to talk to you about what your rights are to get repairs in your rental apartments and some strategies to make sure those repairs get done. As always, we have closed captioning for today's event. As a viewer, you have to activate closed captioning to view the text on your device. If you're in Zoom, click on Live Transcript in Meeting Controls to start viewing closed captioning. If you're in the Facebook Live event, you'll see a settings button in the bottom right-hand corner of the video. Click on CC for closed caption to activate the process. This forum is being recorded and everyone who RSVP'd is going to get a link to the video of the event, all the resources that we post in the chat, and the presenters' PowerPoints. So let's move on to the event. This evening's roundtable is titled, Get It Fixed, Know Your Rights to Get Repairs in Your Rental Apartment. And our office receives so many calls from constituents needing repairs in their apartment. Some of you listening may not have had your apartments painted in years, or you have plaster coming from the ceiling or mold growing due to leaks that haven't been fixed, or you don't have a working fridge or stove. And you've tried to reach out to your super, to your building manager, to landlord, but still your repairs aren't done. Hopefully after this evening's event, you'll have the strategies you need to get those repairs fixed. To help you move forward, we have three wonderful speakers this evening who will be able to explain what your rights are and the strategies you can employ to advocate effectively to get the repairs you need. So we have lots to cover, so let me get right to it. Our first speaker is Michael Grinthal. He's the Director of Housing Rights at TakeRoot Justice, and he's going to talk to you about what your rights are and give you some strategy to deal with the repairs. And following Michael, we'll hear from Sateesh Nori, the Executive Director of JustFix. Sateesh and his team have developed online tools that you can use to help advocate with your landlord. And finally, we'll hear from Andrea Shapiro, the Program and Advocacy Director at Met Council on Housing. And Andrea will provide an overview how to work with your neighbors to get repairs made. And this is New York. I don't talk to my neighbors, but if you need repairs, you'll probably find out that your neighbors also need repairs. Many of you have submitted questions about your rights as a tenant to get these repairs done. And after the presentation, Sarah Hale Stern, Senator Krueger's Chief of Staff, will moderate the Q&A portion of the event. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Michael Grinthal. And good evening, Michael.
Good evening. Thank you, Wendy. Thank you, Senator Krueger, for setting this up. Thank you, all of the Senator's staff, for making it possible. And thank you to all of the attendees for joining us this evening. My name is Michael Grinthal. I am a tenant lawyer, and I have worked as a tenant lawyer in New York City since 2007. And I'm going to talk about steps that people can take to get repairs done in a rental apartment. I'm going to share my screen, so bear with me for one moment while I do that. Okay. So everybody should be able to see an image that shows some tenants sitting on a stoop and the words "getting repairs done." Wendy, let me know if that is not what people can see. Okay. All right. So I want to start just by saying that every tenant in New York has the right to safe, decent living conditions. Landlords are responsible for making repairs, keeping apartments and buildings up to code, providing maintenance and services. And that includes, but is not limited to, making sure that tenants have working appliances and fixtures like light fixtures and plumbing, heat and hot water, which landlords are required to provide free of charge, electricity and gas, if your apartment uses gas for cooking. Tenants may have to pay for those depending on the lease. Regular extermination, repainting at least every 3 years or as needed, fire safety, meaning smoke and carbon monoxide detectors, sprinklers, fire doors, sanitary trash storage and removal, cleaning of the public areas. And again, that's not an exhaustive list, but those are some of the most common conditions that need regular upkeep. And it's the responsibility of the landlord to provide those things, and you have the right to those. You also have the right to have repairs whenever any of those things or anything else is not working, is not in good repair, or is not up to code. And that includes having a 24-hour phone number that you can call in case of emergencies, posted in a public space in the building, timely response to requests for repairs. If your building has 9 units or more, 9 apartments or more, there should be a live-in superintendent or 24-hour janitor services, or a super that's located within 200 feet of the building, so it could be in the building next door. Safe removal of lead paint and mold, meaning that when a landlord does repairs, they have to follow the very strict laws that we have in New York for how lead paint and mold are repaired, to make sure that you and all of your neighbors are safe while repairs are being done. You have the right to have repairs done by licensed professionals for the kind of work where a license is required, like plumbing, electrical repairs, carpentry, major renovation that requires contractors. Again, this is not an exhaustive list, but this is these are examples of the kinds of standards that we all as tenants in New York City have the right to expect. So what happens when you're not when you need repairs done? And a simple request to the landlord is not getting the job done. And you should always start with a straightforward request, even when based on past experience, you don't expect that to work, even when you've had trouble with a landlord before. It's still important to go through all of the steps and make sure that you've exhausted the effort to let the landlord do the right thing. Because for most of these other steps most of these other strategies that we're going to talk about, there will come a point where a judge or an agency or an inspector is going to want to know whether you tried all of the steps before you escalated things. So I'm going to talk about 3 tactics that are available to tenants in New York to get repairs done when a simple request is not working. The first one, actually, let me go back. The 3 tactics are bringing a case in housing court against the landlord, called an HP action. The second is to withhold rent, either by yourself or with neighbors. And the third, which is available only to rent stabilized and rent controlled tenants, is to make a complaint to the city agency DHCR. And I'll be coming back to each of those to go into them in more depth in turn. But no matter which strategy you're going to use, you want to start by laying a good, strong foundation for what you're doing. So first, you want to document the problem. You want to make sure that you have laid a good paper trail and developed evidence for whatever kind of conflict is coming down the line. So first, notify the landlord of the repairs that are needed. And as a lawyer, I always recommend that people notify the landlord in writing, because then you have a record that you've done that. And that can be an email, it can be a letter, it can be a text, something that you'll be able to show later. Even if you're talking to even if the super is in the building and you're talking to them face to face, even if you have a phone number you can call, it's always a good idea to follow that up with something in writing so that later on you have a good paper trail. Call 311 to get an inspector to come out and document the condition and place a violation. Now, I know that a lot of people have had frustrating experiences calling 311, both because it can take a number of calls to get somebody out. And then when they do come out, when an inspector does come out and place a violation, it can be disappointing because nothing happens immediately. A violation doesn't repair itself. Sometimes getting a violation placed is enough to jolt a landlord into doing the repairs, but very often it's just the beginning. Nevertheless, it's so crucial to get a violation placed if you can, because no matter what avenue you follow, whether you go to court, whether you withhold rent, whether you go to DHCR, you're going to be asked whether there is a violation placed by HPD or the Department of Buildings. And if you have a violation, a judge or somebody at DHCR is going to tend to believe that and take that as the gold standard of an independent observer having documented that there's a problem. And on the other side, if you don't have a violation, very often judges will then be suspicious. Why isn't there a violation? That makes me think that maybe there isn't really something going on. So that's why it's worthwhile to go through the steps of calling 311, getting an inspector to come out and getting a violation placed. Even though it doesn't seem like it's going to do anything in the short term, it is the ammunition and the evidence that you're going to use further down the line. And finally, document the problem yourself if you can. If it's the kind of condition that you can take a photograph of, take pictures of it. If it's not that kind of condition, if it's heat or noise or something that you can't take a photograph of, at least keep a journal so that later you'll be able to be certain about the times and the dates and how long things lasted, when there was heat, when there wasn't. If it's a problem with heat, keep a regular journal where you check the temperature every day at the same time and you take notes so that you have a very complete record. If you don't have a way to check the temperature, recommend going to the hardware store and getting a cheap thermometer, or Sateesh Nori is going to speak after me from an excellent organization called HeatSeek that has solutions for people to document the temperatures in their apartments. Now, if your request to the landlord and you're getting violations placed hasn't been enough to get the landlord to take action, one strategy that we have available to us as tenants in New York City is called an HP action. And that's a case that a tenant brings in housing court against their landlord. And HP stands for housing part, which is just a reference to the part of the court that you bring it in. And an HP action, if you're successful, results in a court order ordering the landlord to do the repairs within us by a certain deadline. And it can also result in the landlord having to pay civil penalties or fines to the city. Now, the pros, the upside to doing an HP action is that it puts you on the offense. You're the plaintiff. You're the one who's brought the case, and the landlord is reacting. Another positive is that HP actions can be brought by individual tenants, or they can be brought by tenants as a group. So you can get together with other tenants in your building to bring a case together which is far more powerful and far more likely to get results. And Andrea is going to speak later on from Met Council about the power of working together in groups of tenants. And HP Action is also the fastest of all of these strategies. It pays off the fastest. And like I said, you can get a court order and possibly civil penalties or a fine for the landlord to pay, which is a real teeth to get a landlord to act. The downsides to consider before bringing in HP Action is it does require you to go to court. You may have to go to court multiple times. That can be time consuming. It takes energy. You may miss work. If you are not a regulated tenant, you want to be aware of the fact that landlords may react strongly to that. It's illegal in New York State for a landlord to refuse to renew a lease or to bring an eviction case in retaliation for somebody trying to enforce the housing code and bring in HP Action. But the truth is, it happens. And I hope that, our hope is always that people stand up for their rights and fight, but our hope also is that when people do that, we do it with our eyes open, and we know that landlords sometimes do things that they shouldn't do, and illegal things. And finally, so I mentioned that a landlord can face fines, civil penalties in an HP Action. That money goes to the city. There isn't right now a provision in the law where you get money back through an HP Action. If you are filing an HP Action, it is something that most people can do without a lawyer. It's fairly straightforward. You can do it yourself or you can do it with a group. You go to housing court, which if you're in Manhattan is at 111 Center Street downtown. If you're in Queens, it's on Sutphin Boulevard in Jamaica. And you go to the clerk's office in the courthouse. They give you a couple of forms to fill out where you give information about yourself and your landlord. You list the basis for your case, which is the repairs that need to be made. You can also request that HPD come and do an inspection if you haven't already had that. And there is a $45 filing fee. So it costs $45 to bring an HP Action, but you can apply to have that fee waived if you are low income. And that does happen quite often in housing court. Once you file, you have to serve the papers on the landlord, which you get instructions on how to do. And you usually get a court date, which could be anywhere from 2 weeks to a month out. Right now, the housing courts are still somewhat backed up. And so the wait times are a bit unpredictable. And that's how you start an HP Action. And it's very common that the first time you get to court, the landlord will agree to do repairs. So even though it can take more than one court date for a case to wind its way through the court system, very often when you get to court, a landlord or their lawyers see that you're serious. And if this is where it comes in really handy that you have a record of HPD code violations placed, because when they see that, they usually understand, they usually see the writing on the wall and agree to do the repairs. So, I apologize that I'm just going to go fairly quickly over each of these options. There's a lot more to talk about HP Actions, but I want to make sure that we have time to talk about other options. And so I'm going to move on to another option we have in New York, which is tenants have the right to withhold rent when there are repairs in the apartment that aren't getting done. We have something called the warranty of habitability, which gives tenants the right to withhold rent and possibly to get an abatement, a reduction of rent, if it's found that they went a significant length of time with major violations in the apartment. So just like bringing an HP action, there are pros and cons to this. The pros are that your rent is the most powerful leverage you have. If you really want a landlord to pay attention, withholding rent is, it's the reason that they are a landlord, and it is what they need from you, and it is what makes us powerful as tenants. In addition, unlike the HP action, you may be able to wind up getting some reduction in rent for the conditions that you had to live with before it was repaired. The cons, and these aren't reasons necessarily not to do it, but they're things to be aware of before you make a decision to withhold rent. One is, most of the time when you withhold rent, the next thing that happens is it provokes the landlord into taking you to housing court for non-payment of rent, to bring an eviction case against you. And you should always remember that if you're withholding your rent, make sure you set it all aside. Because even if you win the case and a judge says that you are entitled to a rent abatement, a reduction in rent, you are still going to have to pay the rest of the rent. So if a judge says, I agree with you, you've been living with unacceptable conditions, I'm going to reduce your rent by 25% for the whole 6 months that you had to live with that. They're also going to say, and now you must pay the remaining 75% of the rent. And you don't want to be in a situation where you win a moral victory and then are on the hook for the rent. So it's so important when withholding rent to make sure that you have it all set aside. If you choose to withhold rent, you want to make sure that you take some basic steps. First, you want to make sure that the landlord knows about the condition, because you can only get a rent abatement if a landlord fails to make repairs that they knew about. So you want to make sure you notify them in writing of the condition and tell them you're withholding rent until it gets fixed. Make sure that you have a proof that you notified them in writing, whether that's because you emailed it, or if you're mailing it, we always recommend sending it certified mail, return receipt requested. And then, as I said, set aside all of your rent each month so that you are ready if and when a judge says, okay, here's my ruling, and you have to pay some portion of that rent. A rent strike is when all of the tenants, or a critical mass of the tenants in a building, withhold their rent altogether. And obviously that is far more powerful than when somebody withholds their rent by themselves. If you and your neighbors are considering a rent strike, talk to a local tenant organization. It makes a big difference to have an organizer like Andrea or Met Council who can help you make sure that everything is in place. It helps to talk to a lawyer. You don't need a lawyer to do a rent strike, but it really helps to have somebody who can tell you the ins and outs. It's important to plan carefully, make sure that everybody understands what they're getting into and that everybody can rely on everybody else. The Right to Counsel NYC Coalition has a great written toolkit for rent strikers that you can read at the link at the bottom of the slide, which I think has been shared in the chat. It's a couple years out of date. You'll notice that it refers to COVID and the eviction moratorium, but everything else in it is still incredibly up to date and very helpful. And that was written by tenants, organizers, and lawyers together. And then finally, if you are a rent stabilized or rent controlled tenant, you have the option of making a complaint to the Division of Housing and Community Renewal, DHCR. That's the New York State agency that oversees rent stabilization and rent control. The pros of this is that everything is done in writing by mail or online. You don't have to go to court. You don't have to take time off from work. This can lead to a small rent reduction until the landlord fixes the conditions. So it's very convenient and it can save you some money. The downsides are that this is definitely the slowest. DHCR is very overloaded and they tend to move slowly. And of course, it's not available unless you're rent stabilized or rent controlled. If you do plan to submit a DHCR rent reduction complaint, just like all of the other strategies, you want to notify the landlord in writing of the condition, give them a couple of weeks to do the repair. And if they don't do the repair, you want to get HPD to come out, do an inspection, place a violation. You can fill out the complaint form online, and there's a link there on the slide. You can also call DHCR through 311, and they will mail the complaint to your apartment. Once you submit it, and there's a complaint that says, here is where I live, these are the conditions that are in my apartment, I'm asking for my rent to be reduced. DHCR then, you don't have to send a copy of that to the landlord yourself, you send it to DHCR, they send a copy to the landlord has a certain amount of time to respond to DHCR, they send the response to you, and so on and so forth, back and forth, which is the reason it tends to move slowly. So it can take months or even years. That's the downside to the convenience of this. DHCR may send an inspector of their own to check whether the condition exists. If they do find that the condition hasn't been repaired, they roll back your rent to the rent in your last lease. So one rent increase, and then the rent remains frozen until the landlord proves to DHCR that they've done the repair. So that means even if you have a new lease where your rent would normally go up, it doesn't go up. Your rent just stays frozen until the landlord submits evidence and proves that they have done the repair. So that wraps up my portion of our presentation today. Here are some helpful websites, and don't worry about trying to write all of that down. I believe we'll be sharing these slides later on, but these are the helpful websites that where you can look up information about your building or your landlord, or you can submit complaints online. Thanks. So I'm going to turn things over to Sateesh Nori from HeatSeek, and I will stop sharing my screen. Thank you very much.
Michael, I want to thank you so much. That was so clear. Just a wonderful presentation. And we're very excited that Sateesh is going to present next. He is affiliated with JustFix, and he is going to share some of his online tools. So welcome, Sateesh.
Thank you, Wendy, and thank you, Michael. It's really great to be on this panel and to talk to all of you. And I've seen some really thoughtful and important questions in the Q&A. So I'm really happy to answer those questions, but hopefully someone else can take over the Q&A responsibility while I do my presentation. So Michael set us up very well to talk about JustFix. JustFix is a technology company. We are a nonprofit, and we exist to help tenants fight for housing conditions. So all of the things that Michael described, JustFix aims to make easier for tenants to accomplish. So let me talk about who I am. I am a lawyer. I'm an admitted lawyer, but I don't always admit it. That's a terrible joke. And I, like Michael, worked in legal services for 20 years, all across New York City, in every borough. And now I work at this company called JustFix. And I hope to bring my experience and knowledge about housing law, about tenant defense, and about housing conditions to help as many people as we can who face housing conditions in their own apartments and homes. So what's the problem that we aim to resolve? There's a structural problem. And
Sorry
there's
to
an
interrupt,
informational
Sateesh.
problem.
We're
Yeah.
not seeing your slides for some reason.
Oh, really? Okay, I'm so sorry. Hold on. Can you see them now?
Yes.
Okay, I'll just keep it at this scale.
Got it.
And you didn't miss anything so far. So the problem is there's a structural problem and an informational problem. And the structural problem, and many of you have alluded to this in the Q&A while Michael was presenting, the structural problem is that it's very hard to communicate with landlords. It's very hard to document the problems that exist in apartments. It's very hard to schedule repairs with the landlord or the super or the workers for the building. And frankly, it's very hard to get into court to understand what types of papers, what forms are necessary, how to fill those forms out, how to serve those papers, how many times you have to appear in court. Those are all significant challenges when you're fighting for repairs. And then there's an informational problem, a gap, and that is it's really hard to know who your landlord is, who is responsible. You may have a landlord who is an LLC or a corporation, so you really can't tell who the people are who run that corporation or own that corporation. It is difficult to hold people responsible if they don't do what they promised to do, if they don't make the repairs. And there are so many city agencies and state agencies, and some of you asked, what's the difference between DHCR and HPD, for example? There's really an alphabet soup of housing agencies in New York City and New York State. And it really takes years for someone to understand what they all do, how they interact with each other, and which ones are relevant to the problems that you might be facing at any given time. So there's HPD, which is the Department of Housing Preservation and Development. They're mainly responsible for housing conditions inside New York City. There's DHCR, which is the Division of Homes and Community Renewal. They're responsible for rent stabilized housing, which can be in New York City or throughout New York State. There's a Department of Buildings, which deals with building permits and construction issues. There's the Department of Finance, which some of you may know if you have SCREE or DREE, but that's kind of the tax payment agency within the state. And then there's all of the local offices of your elected officials, your city council members, your borough president, the mayor's office, and so on. So there's a lot of information and there's a lot of obstacles in the way when people seek repairs. So our mission is to make tools with tenants, organizers, and advocates so that people like all of you can obtain safe, decent, healthy housing and ultimately achieve a measure of housing justice. We believe that there should be a human right to housing, and that human right to housing is not just four walls, a floor, and a roof, but the quality, the safety of that housing really matters. And if you're living in a home that is not properly maintained, there isn't heat, there might be roaches or rats, that doesn't meet any definition of quality housing, of safe housing, or of this, aspirational human right to housing, which we're all reaching for. So one of the things that forms the foundation for tenants' rights to safe, habitable, healthy housing is this court case. It's called Javins versus First National Realty. And the case is from 1970. It's not even a New York case. It's a Washington, D.C. case. But what this case defines for everyone at this point is that there's a thing called a warranty of habitability. And this is, in a sense, a contract term that is read into every lease. So even if your lease says you're responsible for your own repairs, the landlord is responsible for your repairs. Now, someone asked about a co-op, and if you're a shareholder with a proprietary lease to a co-op, that's a different story, and we can talk later. But for everybody else, there is this right that you have to have your apartment repaired by the landlord. And that right is independent of whether you pay rent, you owe rent, whether you have a lease. This is something that is fundamental to this topic, to this issue. So one of the things that's happening right now in New York City is there's a right to counsel for tenants. And if you've ever faced eviction, or if you faced eviction in the past few years, you might have been assigned a free lawyer from legal aid, legal services, or groups like Michael's. And one of the things that's happening, unfortunately, is those lawyers are so busy with the eviction cases that they don't necessarily have the time or the capacity to take on cases where tenants are only fighting for repairs. They can only take the cases where tenants are facing eviction because they have to triage these cases. It's like an emergency room in a hospital. You've got to see the most serious patients first. And unfortunately, tenants who have repairs in the right to counsel world right now are not being prioritized. So that's why there's room for organizations like JustFix. We actually create tools that will help you navigate this complicated process and get the information that you need so that you have a chance at fighting for your own repairs. So we do a lot of research from people or of people who use our tools or who are facing housing conditions. And there's a lot of things that we hear. So here are some of the highlights of our user research studies. One of the things we hear is that we will risk eviction to get repairs. And what that tells us is that people are really serious and concerned and motivated to seek repairs in their homes, to the point that they will stop paying rent in order to force the landlord to sue them so that they can raise their repairs in housing court. And that's very dangerous because you might actually get evicted if an eviction case is filed against you. Nevertheless, people have told us over and over again that repairs are so important to them that they will risk eviction to get repairs. Another thing that we hear often is that we want repairs, not money damages. And this is something that policymakers, lawyers, judges don't necessarily understand. It is that tenants want repairs because repairs impact their quality of life, their own health, mental and physical health, their happiness, and it's what they're entitled to under the law. It's not just about money. It's not just about getting a month or two off rent to make a tenant go away, to satisfy a tenant. Tenants have told us over and over again that repairs are more important than money damages or money off rent owed. And this is really important to note because the system does not operate under this assumption. The housing court system and HPD and many of the players in the housing repair ecosystem seem to think that if we just give the tenant enough money off their rent, they'll go away and they'll be happy because that's what they really want. But it's not in fact the case. People want repairs. Next is we hear that people are willing to wait to get these repairs, to get justice. And they're willing to go to great lengths. They're willing to write letters. They're willing to organize with their neighbors. They're willing to file court cases and to go to court over and over again. They're willing to testify. They're willing to bring pictures and evidence to court. They're willing to talk to government agencies and elected officials and newspapers to really explain what's happening to them. And that again highlights this fact that repairs really matter to people. And we need to focus on these issues because they impact people every day in a very personal and direct way. So let me show you, and I'm almost done, what JustFix is and how it works. So can everyone see this website? I assume so.
Yes.
Okay, great. So this is our landing page, and it's made to work even if you don't have a computer. If you have a phone with a screen, and I know many people do nowadays, this will work on your phone with a screen. If you can take a photo, or if you can look at the New York Times on your phone, you can go to JustFix. So what do you do when you get here? How can this help you? Well, one of the things that you can do, and I know Michael talked about all of the initial steps that you need to take if you're going to build a case to get your landlord to make repairs, we can do all those steps for you right from your phone. So if you click on this button here, it says Start My Letter of Complaint. You will be walked through step by step a process by which you can identify the repairs just by clicking boxes on a form that's on your phone screen and typing in your address, and we will find your landlord using our search tool. And then at the end of the process, we will actually type out a letter for you and mail it for you for free to your landlord with your address on it, as if it's coming from you. And that mail is done for free by certified mail. And the letter contains your list of repairs that you created. It goes to your landlord based on your address, and we look it up to make sure it's the right address. And it also contains all the legal language that tells the landlord what happens if they don't do the repairs and why they have to do the repairs. So we've found that in 30% of the cases, when we send these letters, the landlord makes repairs, and that's a huge number. And in those other 70% of the cases where the landlord doesn't make all the repairs, the letter serves as evidence. You can take that letter with you if you go to court and you get a lawyer, and it already establishes the first step, what the conditions are, how you told the landlord about them, and the proof that you sent this letter to them. So it's a great place to start. Now, the other things that we do, and we're working on some things outside the repair space, you can find out everything there is to know about your landlord. So just by typing your landlord's name or your street address, you can find out everything that the city knows about your landlord. You can find out how many buildings your landlord owns, how many people they tried to evict last year, how many violations exist on HPD's database, the property ownership records, and also what other landlords your landlord is connected to. Are they just a mom and pop like many landlords claim to be? Or are they a huge corporation with lots of money, and therefore they have no excuse to not make repairs? The other thing we can do for you is we can help you get your rent history. So if you submit your request for a rent history, all you have to do is put in your name, your address, your apartment number, and your phone number. And within a week, your rent history will be mailed to you. So how great is that? It couldn't be easier. Without this tool, people would have to go to DHCR or fill out a form and be unsure of whether it actually got to DHCR and wait a long time to get their rent history. So if you live in a rent stabilized apartment, you can use this, it's called a text bot, to get your rent history. We also have a tool in Los Angeles, which is very similar. And we're adding a lot of features to these tools, like the ability to add photographs of repairs or conditions to your letter, the ability to get alerts if your landlord is docked with new violations for your building or your apartment, and so on. And we are really motivated to work with tenants, with organizers, advocates, elected officials, to make sure that the process is simple and all of the information is available to people as they need it. So I'll stop there. These are some of our partners. You may already know about them and work with them. And I'm happy to answer questions either after this presentation or anytime later on. So with that, I'll stop and I'll turn it over to, is it Andrea, I believe.
Thank you, Sateesh. That was That was absolutely terrific. Wonderful tools. And now I'm very pleased to introduce Andrea Shapiro, and she is working at Met Council, and she's going to talk to you about the very scary prospect, I'm just kidding, of really reaching out to your neighbors, because if you have issues in your apartment, it's likely that they do too. So welcome, Andrea.
Thank you so much, Wendy, and thank you, Senator Krueger and Sateesh and Michael. Unlike Sateesh and Michael, I am not a lawyer. I'm a tenant organizer. And a good thing, that's what I'm going to talk to everyone about. And so today we're going to talk about what it means to form a tenant association. And next slide, please. So a tenant association is actually a really simple thing. And it's a group of tenants coming together from the same building to solve a problem. And often that is a repair in a public space or a shared space, such as an elevator or heat and hot water, or it can be lots of people up repairs inside of your apartment. And it's very rare that if one person needs a repair, that no one else needs repairs. Usually landlords are lazy throughout the building. Next slide. And so, as Wendy mentioned, it's really scary to talk to your neighbors, to form a tenants association. Many of us, are worried what happens if I talk to my neighbors? Am I gonna hide from them in the elevator the rest of the time I live in this building? But it's actually a really simple and actually sort of fun process. Next slide. And if you want to click twice, sorry, forgot about the animation. And so part of it is just talking and listening. And I can start out with the conversations that you're already having in the elevator or by the mail, where you sort of complain to each other and move on, and then mentioning it to someone else. And it starts with just talking to one other person in your building and then moves on from there. And it's important that you're not doing it yourself or you're going to be miserable. It's important that you ask others to help you in your building. And the first meeting can feel chaotic and weird, of everyone just getting together in the lobby and listening to each other, hearing what the other people's complaints are, and learning about what your rights are. Many of us, as been mentioned so far, we actually don't know what our rights are and what can be done. And so a lot of tenants live with repair issues because they didn't know that there was something that could be done or how to do it. And then we want to dig into the issues. How long have people lived in the building for? Have people filed for overcharges in the past? Or do people know their rent stabilization status? One of the first things we actually do at most of our meetings is have people get their rent histories, because it's amazing the amount of apartments that were illegally deregulated. And so not only can you get repairs, but you also might get some money back, which is not bad. Next slide. And so it's important, one of the things that we often hear is that folks are a little nervous, that they haven't lived in the building long enough, or there's too many new tenants in the building. A big secret is it's never too early or too late. So you might have problems with your landlord for decades and never done anything, or you might have just moved in or might just start having problems. It's important to actually do the action. Rather, we often talk ourselves out of talking to our neighbors, of doing something together. I've seen in the question and answer, I'm the only rent stabilized tenant left. There's a lot of people who are empty. We have a lot of protections, particularly rent stabilized, rent controlled tenants. And so we need to use those protections to get the repairs we need. No one's going to do it for us. And all of the rights that have been mentioned so far were won by tenants. So the right to repairs, rent stabilization itself was won by tenants fighting. And so now we need to use those rights. The next step is knocking on doors. Start with the people you know, and then try a few other people. We always recommend bring a piece of paper, a notebook. That way you can get people's information. And often a good way of starting a tenant association is starting a text group. You can text the other folks in your building, find and share information that way, and just start by having conversations. And it's okay if things go slowly. Tenants associations are not things that happen overnight, and they don't make change overnight. And that slow process actually is useful because people can build trust with each other. You get to know each other through a text group or a Facebook group. You get to meet each other, find out about what else is going in the building, and you can ask for help. I need someone to take in a package for me. Or does anyone know what day alternate side parking is? Things like that are a really good way to start because they're low stakes. And then it's time to actually have a meeting. Once you have people excited, people interested, pick that date and go for it. Knock on doors, get people out, put up signs, and you're allowed to put signs up in common areas of your building and meet in common areas of your building. And it's important to accept the fact that maybe only 1 or 2 people are going to show up, but those 2 or 3 people are the people who are going to help you in the future to get more people out. Starting slow, starting small is not a bad thing. It allows you to build. And maybe you come together and you do realize it's only your apartment, but that's very rare. And having a meeting in the lobby is actually really useful because you get people coming in and out of the building. So maybe someone will stop for a few minutes, listen, and say, yeah, I have that problem too, and put their name down. And that's one more person in your tenants association. And I know it feels scary to meet in your lobby because you're out in public, your landlord will know, your super will know, but that's actually sort of the point, is if we organize in private and never try and show our power that we care, then it won't do anything. We need to show our power to our landlords because landlords are bullies, and standing up to bullies actually gets them to back down. And so similar to filing an HP case, starting a tenants association is often a great way to get repairs. Just simply starting it is sometimes enough. And then it's always good that you have a mix of long-term and new tenants who are starting it. That way you get all the demographics in your building. And it's also good that if you don't speak the language that other people speak in your building, you get one tenant who does. Or you can also ask the senator's office or one of our organizations for some help with translation. And you can always start with just Google Translate and move on from there. Making an effort will bring people into your tenants association. Next slide. And I'm sorry, you're gonna have to click a few times. So you're about to have your first meeting. What do you need to do? So one of the things is do some research using what Sateesh showed us of who owns what. Is a really good way to start figuring out who is my landlord. Are they a person? Are they a corporation? Do they own other apartments? And who owns what will also show how many rent stabilized apartments are in your building. And so if things aren't matching up to what you know there might be another problem. And then make a plan with your neighbors. So again, you should not be doing this alone. Get 1 or 2 other people to help you. And maybe you each take 2 floors or 1 floor and knock on those doors. That makes it feel a little less overwhelming. Have a flyer that you can pass out, hang up. Make it exciting. Make it a party. There's no reason why organizing needs to be serious. And it's great to start out with, we're going to have wine and cheese in the lobby and talk about our landlord. or have a pizza party or a Halloween party, or an Easter egg hunt in your lobby as a way of starting. It takes the pressure off and people are willing to come and see what's happening, and people want to have a good time and meet each other. And it's always great to plan on what you're going to say to your neighbors when you get to that door. Don't expect to knock on the door and just have something magical to say. I've been knocking on doors for a long time, and I can tell you every single time I get nervous, and I'm glad that I have a script and I've practiced. And so that's what's good to go over with the neighbors that you're working with or friends and family. What am I going to say that's going to attract people to open their door to talk to me? And I have to say, you wouldn't think it living in New York, but knocking on someone's door and saying, do you need repairs? Do you hate your landlord? Is your rent too high? Any of those questions, you'll get a surprising number of people opening their door because it's true. And people don't want to live with disrepair. They don't want to pay high rent. And so getting that door open, asking them for contact information, and simple questions like, what repairs do you need? Or I'm hearing that there's a leak running down the entire A line. Are you getting that leak? Do you know the last time we had a roof done was 20 years ago? Or I saw some MCIs in the chat. Did you know we're getting this rent increase and we can fight it? Simple things like that really get people's attention. When you go to someone's door, you don't need to tell them your life story. And you don't need to have a lot to say. In fact, you actually want to have very little to say. You want to spend most of your time listening. Next slide. And again, I'm sorry, you're going to have to click. So next I'm going to talk about what the meeting can look like. And so, oops, sorry. We want to make sure that's productive. No one wants to go to a meeting that's boring and doesn't go anywhere. So having an agenda, making it very clear on what you would like to do, and you can't do everything in one meeting. So pick 1 or 2 items that you want to cover, things that you might make a decision over or take action, and make sure you record who will do that and when it will be done by. That way you can hold each other accountable. Because we've all been in meetings where someone takes on a lot and then doesn't do anything. Again, make it a party, make it enjoyable. Particularly for your first meeting, people want to come to something that's fun. They just don't want to come and complain about their landlord. Though again, we're New Yorkers, so complaining about our landlord is sort of second nature to us. And then we want it to be short. No one really wants to attend a 3-hour meeting, 4-hour meeting. And those meetings tend to be less productive. So keeping it to an hour and a half, 2 hours at most, and making sure that you're getting things done and you have a plan to get things done at the meeting is really important. And people will respect you for that. And they'll want to come back because they know that they're going to get things done. They're going to fight for the repairs that they need. Next slide. So it's important while we're having the meeting to make sure that it's very clear how we're making decisions and that it's done by a group. Because it feels really crappy to come to a meeting where one person speaks and makes a decision and you're like, why was I here? No one really cared what I have to say. And particularly as you go forward to things like an HP case that Michael talked about, or even a rent strike, you'll need a group decision making so you know how things are being decided and what's going to happen. Again, really clear next steps. Who's going to do it, when it's going to be done by, and what it is. And then make sure that everyone gets a chance to speak. Some people are going to speak a lot. Some people are going to be quiet. We want to encourage the quiet people to speak and the loud people to listen. That way, everyone's involved in our tenant association. And that's it. It's pretty simple, even though it seems really scary. It's worth trying. And the worst thing that happens is you don't have a tenants association. but at least you tried, and you're likely to get a few people to come together and get those repairs you need and that they need. And on that, I'm going to turn it back over to, I believe, Wendy or Sarah.
Hi, thank you so much, Andrea, and to Michael and Sateesh before you. So we received just an absolutely overwhelming number of questions before tonight's event. So we're going to try to get through as many of them as we possibly can. And I know some questions are also going to be, are being answered in the chat. But I wanted to remind everyone that you can continue to be posting additional questions, and we will try to get through to as many of them as we possibly can. And also, it's always a good idea, to be reaching out to your local elected officials for more help, particularly with the very individualized questions that have been coming in. We're going to be trying to, through the Q&A, cover the ones that are applicable to many people's situations. So I believe that there will be in the chat an added a tool to look up who your local elected officials are. Well, Senator Krueger is very happy to be sponsoring tonight's event. We're really in the best position to be helping constituents in our district. So if you live elsewhere in the city, it's best to reach out to your state senator, assembly members, or city council member who can help you, connect you with local advocacy groups and give you some more specific guidance on what's going on in your situation. So we'll start with the questions we've received beforehand. And so we've received many questions asking who's responsible for paying for repairs that are needed. So if you then what types of repairs can lead to what's known, particularly in rent stabilized apartments, as individual apartment improvements. So can you all talk about what kinds of repairs owners are responsible for paying for entirely themselves, and then when tenants may need to incur either some sort of a rent increase or some other type of cost?
Thanks. I'll give that a shot. So the rule in 99.99% of situations is it is the landlord's responsibility to make repairs at their own cost. They cannot charge tenants for making repairs, and that is true whether you live in a rent stabilized or market rate apartment. It is the law that property owners have to keep their properties up to code and have to provide habitable apartments for people. The only time when improvements to an apartment can be passed on to the tenant are when you are rent stabilized or rent controlled, and the work being done is not a repair but an improvement. So not maintaining the apartment, but actually putting in something that goes above and beyond what's necessary to keep the apartment in condition. And even then, it can only be the basis for rent increase if the tenant signs in writing an agreement that they agree to have the rent go up for this. So it's not possible to request a repair or let the landlord in to do a repair and then get surprised later that your rent is going up. That's for repairs or improvements that happen in one apartment. If a landlord makes a building-wide improvement, what's called a major capital improvement, an MCI, they may be able to get approval from DHCR, from the state, to raise the rent. But that has to be something that affects the entire building. So something like replacing the roof, replacing the facade of the building, replacing all the windows in the building, fixing the elevator, replacing the electrical system, something that is a major overhaul. That can be done without getting permission from the tenants, but they have to apply to DHCR and make their case that they deserve a rent increase. Tenants are notified of that and have the opportunity to oppose it. For example, saying, my apartment wasn't included in that, or the work wasn't done well, or the roof still leaks.
And on the flip side is, at what point can a tenant say, I'd really like to make this repair myself, or hire my own contractor to do an upgrade? Is that something that is legally safe for a tenant to pursue, or can that bring up other problems?
It's generally not a good idea to do your own work. There is no legal right of tenants to do their own work, even if you don't trust the landlord to do it. There's no legal right to do that. Most leases have somewhere in it a clause that says it's a violation of the lease to do your own work or your own alterations to the apartment. So hiring somebody to do your own, to do work in your apartment can lead to getting evicted. If you really, really want to do it, then make sure you get very specific written consent from the landlord, where the landlord is signing off saying, I agree to you doing these exact things.
And I know that Sateesh, both you and Michaels throughout the event spoke about the fact that although there are all sorts of laws and regulations on the books for what are considered timely repairs, and even after complaints are filed, that it's very common, even after violations are issued, for it still to take an extended period of time to actually to get the repairs or other work done. Can you speak a little bit about what timely may mean for different types of work that people need to have done in their apartments or throughout their building?
Sure. And let me first say, what makes a timely repair is not a legal question. It's what, a timely repair is a repair that's done in a decent amount of time so that you can live your life in a decent place. The law sets some timelines, but you don't have to, you do not have to sit back and say, it's okay with me if you take 90 days to do this. But when it comes to code violations, they're split into 3 categories. They call them A, B, and C, and that's based on how severe and hazardous they are. And C is the most hazardous, immediately hazardous, and that usually means like a broken window, no lock on the door, water pouring from the ceiling, no heat. And landlords actually have, Sateesh or Andrea, correct me if I'm getting this wrong, they are supposed to correct it within 48 hours. It is called immediately hazardous. The next category is B, which is hazardous, and that's things that are serious but not emergency level. And that could be like cracks in the floor, a leak where the water's not pouring from the ceiling. For those, it's 30 days. And everything else, which are non-hazardous, like peeling paint that's not lead paint, things that are, that are ugly or aesthetically problematic but not dangerous, they have 90 days. But again, to be clear, that's not a law that says your landlord should take 90 days to paint your, that's how long it takes before they start getting fined if a violation is placed. That is not a recommendation that says if you need a repair, you don't have the right to get it within 90 days. A timely repair that shows respect for you and your home and the rent that you're paying is as soon as humanly possible.
And what about emergency situations where someone's health or immediate safety may be at risk? Are there other strategies that tenants should be thinking about in those sorts of situations?
The strategies we've talked about are the ones with the most teeth. When we're talking about, what can I do to make something happen within the next couple hours, it's not really a legal question. The legal system doesn't move that quickly. If you've got an emergency like that, you should, you should use whatever means you have to reach out to the landlord and don't take no for an answer. You should, if you need to, immediately call inspectors, call Con Ed. If you feel comfortable doing it, maybe calling the police is the right thing to do. Again, at that point, it's not really a legal question. And we lawyers will tell you, the law doesn't move in 1 or 2 hour increments. If you need something done today, you don't call a lawyer. And this is actually one of the exceptions where you might call your own repair person. It can be legal, though it is risky, to call your own repair person if you need the repair done and the landlord isn't doing it. So if you have an emergency and you try to reach out to the landlord and they do not respond within a reasonable time, you can let them know, call them back, leave another message, even if it seems futile. Let them know that this is an emergency, you're calling your own plumber, you're calling your own handyman, because you can't live with it. But again, do this as a last resort. It is somewhat risky. And of course, many conditions, a plumber isn't going to show up and be able to do a real fix within a short period of time.
And we also received a number of questions beforehand from people who commented that they used to have tenants associations in their buildings many years ago, maybe when they moved in 20, 30 years ago, and that many of the longtime tenants moved out over the years. And it's that they feel like that the majority of tenants who are moved in more recent years may just stay for a year and move out. And so they found it much harder to make connections and then to find other tenants who are interested in organizing and working with others. Sure, I know this is also something we hear on a regular basis with constituents who are calling our office. But Andrea, I'm curious if you have any thoughts for how to respond to people who feel like it may be hopeless to try to start a tenants association in a building where there may only be a few longtime tenants who are left.
Yeah, people shouldn't assume that people who just moved in want to live with bad repairs either or want to pay too much in rent. Often people just can't get another apartment. That's why they pay so much in rent, not because they're like, yes, I want to pay half my income in rent. And so it's really important just to talk to someone. Ask the new tenants what's going on in their apartments, because I bet they want the same repairs that you want. And just because there was a tenants association in the past doesn't mean you can't have another one now. Tenant associations are not legal entities, so it's not like you have to have the same people involved. Get a few people together, start a tenant association, see what happens. Even if you just start out with a few people, meet in the lobby, meet in a place where people can join you, and make it welcoming so that the new tenants feel welcomed as part of the building, as part of the tenants association.
That's really, really good to be keeping in mind. And we also received many, many questions beforehand about mold issues and both, what responsibilities owners have to try to fix underlying conditions when mold is growing on walls, and also what information has to be shared with tenants about whether or not they're qualified contractors who are actually coming to do the work, and what's found after a mold investigation is done in someone's unit.
So I'm sorry, I was momentarily distracted, so I'm going to put Sateesh on the spot and I'm sure he can help with that.
Oh, sure, yeah,
Right.
I'm just frantically answering the 63 questions in the Q&A as they pop up, but I can probably stop doing that.
So I was just asking that
Kind of like a game for me. at this point.
some questions that we've received many questions about molds, both what responsibilities owners have to fix the underlying conditions, and then to properly fix or to clean up all of the mold that's present within walls within tenants' apartments.
Yeah, the primary obstacle in mold cases is identifying mold. Identifying mold requires a lab test. And while it may seem like mold, it smells like mold, it makes people sick like mold does, it causes rashes, it appears when it rains or when the leak behind the wall gets worse. It's hard to say it's mold without a lab test. And so that's the real challenge in fighting mold. And there are, mold experts. There's one that a lot of housing court lawyers use all the time. It's not cheap. Within NYCHA, it's a huge issue. Recently, a local newspaper wrote about mold issues taking as long as 210 days to resolve in NYCHA apartments. So this is a big issue. It's not one that I can help you address. I think someone suggested legislation. Maybe that's something that we can kind of take away from this, is that there needs to be some more work done in strengthening the laws, in maybe bolstering the Department of Health's ability to assess mold and to identify mold, but it's a big problem.
And there were some changes, I believe, in past years on the city level, I think, to try to strengthen the requirements, and some changes in past years too, at least in terms of who's qualified to do mold testing and remediation. But like with many things, there's still what the laws on the books and then what's actually happening on a day-to-day basis. And certainly something, given the number of questions that have come in just tonight, and that I'm sure we all hear in our work, it definitely sounds like this is an area where more work is needed. So we've received a number of questions also beforehand, specifically around appliances. And I know that Michael spoke about this somewhat in his presentation, but I think it would be helpful to go into a little bit more detail, both for market rate and for rent stabilized tenants, about what tenants' rights are with they have an old stove, an old refrigerator that in many cases may have been in their apartment for 30, 40, 50 years and breaks down, and what rights do the tenants have to either to demand a new stove or at least a working old stove or refrigerator. And then when another issue that's related to this that we often hear is that an owner will replace a refrigerator with a much smaller appliance. And so what protections do tenants have in situations like that?
Sure. Oddly enough, the housing code doesn't actually mention refrigerators. And so there's actually no law governing whether you have a refrigerator. That said, I'm not sure that many landlords know that, and for the most part, we've been able to enforce the right to get a working stove and refrigerator, even in housing court. We're apparently, not sure if I should say this. I don't know if there are any housing court judges on, but most of them don't seem to know that either. So I would treat it as any other repair and use the same methods. I will say the law just doesn't get that fine-grained about what a refrigerator looks like, what features it has, how big it is. So when, if a landlord says, well, here's a replacement working refrigerator and it's a downgrade, not that you should take that, but I have to say, unfortunately, the law is not a very useful tool when we get that fine-grained. And you know, it's pretty common that landlords kind of do that death by 1,000 cuts. I'm complying with the letter of the law, but everything is kind of shoddy or just good enough. And if that's what's happening, you know, then what Andrea talked about, getting together with other tenants, is really the most powerful route. Because some landlords, some management companies are very adept at knowing exactly what the law requires and staying just within that, but saying, you know, your paint's not going to match, and your tiles aren't going to match, and everything is legal, and the law doesn't say things have to be pretty, but it's really disrespectful and it downgrades where you live. Again, you know, the housing court's not going to be a very good tool for that. HPD is not going to place a violation for that, but tenants do have success when they stand up together and say, you have to respect us.
And for tenants who have a decent relationship with the building owner or management and say that that they would greatly prefer to have a new appliance, what options do they have to even say, I'm willing to pay a little bit more to either purchase my own stove or a refrigerator, or if it's a rent stabilized tenant, is there a situation where a tenant needs to worry about their rent going up if they request a new appliance?
So I'll answer the last part of that first. A new appliance is not going to be an individual apartment improvement. And an individual apartment improvement is an actual improvement to the apartment, not, you know, a slightly nicer stove or a refrigerator with an ice maker. You can certainly pay for your own stove or refrigerator. One thing to bear in mind is that appliances and fixtures that are installed in an apartment become part of the apartment legally. They become the property of the landlord, even though the tenant paid for them. So bear that in mind, that, you know, I would only do that as a last resort, or if you really think it's worth it, because you won't be able to take those things with you. I don't know how many people try to take their stoves with them when they move out, but I'm sure it's New York and somebody must.
I've definitely heard of situations where tenants bought their own refrigerator without often getting the proper approval, and then 20 years later were asked, what happened to the 40-year-old refrigerator that used to be in this apartment? So I know those situations can happen.
Well, I'd say, as an aside, you know, definitely don't throw away the old refrigerator or stove without telling the landlord about it, or saying, you know, if you want your old stove, come and pick it up. And probably the landlord will say, I don't want it. And then you're fine when you get rid of it.
And switching topics slightly, we received many questions beforehand about tenants' rights to have their apartments painted on a regular basis, and both just how frequently that's supposed to happen in New York City under existing laws, and then particularly for tenants who are older or have disabilities and may have difficulty getting their apartments ready to be painted, and sometimes are told by an owner, I'm not going to come paint until you move all the furniture out of the way. How, there are any strategies for how tenants can handle situations like that?
Sure. The first part of the question is the easiest part. The law actually says you're entitled to have your apartment repainted every 3 years if you want that. But also, if there's ever a problem with the paint, right? So if the paint is peeling or it's damaged, you can request that it be painted. If the landlord doesn't agree with that, you can call 311, get an inspector to come and place a violation for damaged paint. I've often seen the situation where the landlord says, okay, prepare the apartment, move the furniture, and the tenant can't do that, which is a tough situation. But if if the tenant has a disability that prevents them from being able to move the furniture, and they may not think of themselves as a person with a disability, but what happens to us all as we age that limits our ability to move things, that may in fact be a disability under the law. Then the tenant may have the right to what's called a reasonable accommodation, which is required by civil rights law, by the New York City human rights law, the New York State human rights law, the Fair Housing Act, the Federal Fair Housing Act, which means a reasonable accommodation is some change in policy or rules or a landlord's usual procedures that allow a tenant to get the same benefits that other tenants do. So a reasonable accommodation could mean a landlord will actually, the super, for example, or the porter will help you move the furniture. So that's actually, I don't see very many people actually requesting that. And I don't know how most landlords would respond, but I think it's a reasonable thing to request, because without it, somebody with a disability may have to give up their right to have their apartment painted. And that's exactly what the human rights law is about. So if a tenant wants that, this is the kind of thing that goes beyond what I can quickly say here. But the New York City Commission on Human Rights is the city agency that enforces those laws. And I encourage people to reach out to them. They will prepare a letter to a landlord on a tenant's behalf, requesting a reasonable accommodation. They know what the language to use, and it packs an extra oomph when the landlord sees it coming on city letterhead. And I can share the link to that in the chat later on.
And the next event that we're going to be doing actually is going to be primarily focused on helping tenants think about how to make their apartments more age friendly. And I know we've done events in the past with staff from the Human Rights Commission, and I believe that we may also have someone from there joining our next roundtable. But we often may not necessarily think of contact or urging tenants to think about urging the human rights to contact the Human Rights Commission for things like painting, or preparing an apartment for painting or other type of assistance that they may need in order to take advantage of other rights that they have. But so that's a really important reminder. So speaking of which, and again, as I said, we're going to have a whole other event on making apartments more age friendly and accessible. But we did receive a number of questions beforehand about the rights that tenants have to have things installed in their apartments, like grab bars in their bathtubs, like having their toilets adjusted. And so can you speak just in the broadest terms about the rights the tenants have if they need some minor changes made?
Absolutely. Those kinds of changes, modifications that you're describing are really the classic reasonable accommodations. They're the most common ones to be requested: grab bars, widening of doorways, changing fixtures. And it's pretty well established that that's the kind of thing a landlord has to do if a tenant needs it in order to make use of their apartment. Now, if a landlord can show that because of the nature of the apartment, it can't be done, right? That because of the structure of the apartment, there's no room to widen something, then they may not have to make the accommodation. But the burden is on the landlord to show this isn't feasible. And that's, for example, if you're requesting a ramp and the landlord can show there's not enough room for a ramp next to the stoop. But again, that's the landlord's burden. So tenants who need those things, physical modifications that make the building or their apartment or the hallway accessible for them should go ahead and request it. And again, if they're not sure how to do that, or they're not comfortable doing it, or they've tried it without success, the Commission on Human Rights will actually work with the tenant to prepare a letter to the landlord that goes from the commission to the landlord. And so it's, again, it's written by somebody knowledgeable of the law. It comes on city letterhead. That really can help. And then you're also, if the landlord doesn't respond, you can choose to go ahead to move forward with the commission by filing a complaint. And the commission, then you've started basically, you know, a legal proceeding against the landlord. And the commission will do an investigation. They will demand response from the landlord. And so, you know, it's something that the commission is very good at, is requesting reasonable accommodations.
And these are certainly situations in which tenants have either tried to request reasonable accommodations from their owner, or had difficulty reaching out to the Human Rights Commission, that should absolutely be reaching out to their local elected officials' offices, and we can often help to make those connections. So I think switching gears again, and I think this is very much for any of you, we've received a number of questions both beforehand and I know during tonight's event from tenants who either are afraid to ask their landlords to make repairs because they're afraid of retaliation, or have requested repairs in the past, and some of the work may have been done but not all, but now they feel like either the owner or building staff are retaliating against them. So can you speak a little bit more about what legal protections tenants have in situations like this, and then some more practical strategies, both from the legal side of things, but also the organizing perspective?
You want me to take this? There's 2 questions for you, Michael, in the chat. We're down to, oh, there's 7 now. Okay. You guys type fast in the audience.
And it just shows, there's so many events questions that we receive. I mean, this event easily could go on for many more hours. But
so the question is about retaliation.
And have legal protections against retaliation, but then also just some practical steps that tenants can take and should be keeping in mind.
Yeah, so there is a law that protects tenants from retaliation. It's the retaliatory eviction defense. The problem is, it is really hard to assert this without a lawyer, and it requires a tenant to be sued for eviction, and then to prove that they filed a complaint within 12 months. And so then the presumption shifts to the landlord to show that they're not evicting the tenant because of their complaint filed or made within the last 12 months. So if that sounds complicated, it sure is. And my kind of proposed solution is what's called good cause eviction. And it's something that's on the table. I think it's maybe literally on the governor's desk right now. And it would provide a lot of tenants who are not rent stabilized or who don't live in NYCHA, market rate tenants who live pursuant to their leases only, and when their leases expire, they don't have a right to a new lease. Those tenants would be protected, because right now, if you live in an apartment and your lease has already expired and you're not rent stabilized, you complain and you are exposed to retaliation, and you may be able to successfully prove that the landlord retaliated in court, but that requires a lot of effort and probably requires a lawyer. And we do have right to counsel now, but it still is a stressful way to assert your right to repairs. You would still face this retaliation. So what do you do if that's the case? Well, I mean, you should maybe attempt to renew your lease if that's possible before you make that complaint. And I know that sounds awful, but in cases where, you know, the landlord was going to renew the lease, you might just play it out that way and wait for the lease renewal to come in, sign it, and make the complaint, because then you have 12 months at least locked in. You might get together with your neighbors and organize. The landlord is unlikely, or at least unable, to easily evict everyone in a building, or a majority of the people, or a lot of people. And so if tenants join together and file complaints together, they might feel they might have more protection against retaliatory eviction. But really, you know, this is a big problem. It's something that we see at JustFix, where tenants are afraid to complain because they face retaliation. There's no other way around it. It's just a fact. And there needs to be laws to protect tenants, and good cause eviction is one of those possible laws.
No, absolutely. And I know Senator Krueger is a very, very strong supporter of good cause eviction, and has been for many years, and hopes that it makes it into this year's budget. But I know Andrea's been sharing in the chat that there are advocacy efforts going on in the next few weeks specifically on this. But for even tenants who are rent stabilized, I know we quite often hear that they're, even though they have the right to have their leases renewed, barring very, very unusual circumstances, but that they're still afraid to request repairs, or feel as if they're being retaliated or harassed afterwards. So Andrea, can you speak a little bit about the importance of working with a tenants association in situations like this?
Yeah, so one of the big things is having a tenants association means you're not the target, right? There's a lot of people involved that your landlord has to target. The first thing, though, I always tell tenants is, they tell you now not to go to your doctor alone. Don't talk to your landlord alone or your super alone. Have someone there with you, so that someone else is hearing what is said, and they're there to support you in saying what you need. Because what often happens is we come into situations really nervous, and we don't necessarily ask for the repairs we need, and we're just scared of whatever response is going to happen. And having someone else there actually controls people's behavior a little bit. I know this doesn't work for all landlords, but it's a first start. Then having a tenant association, again, you're not the target. There's a group of you asking for repairs at the same time. And then the other thing that we also say is, you don't need to speak to your landlord unless you want to. So if your landlord's calling you all day, every day, don't answer your phone. There is no requirement that you need to answer the phone to your landlord, the door to your super, or the texts. If they're coming to do the repair, let them in to do the repair. Otherwise, why are you talking to them? Right? That's one of the ways that we often hear about harassment, is simply like these repeated phone calls or someone knocking on your door. Ignore them. You don't have to speak to them. And they'll get bored and they'll move on because they got other tenants to harass. It's also really important to be open, talking to your office if you feel like you're being harassed. You know, but you can bring a court case against harassment as well. So it's important that we just don't let harassment happen, that we actually fight back against it, we stand up to it, even though I know harassment cases are not the easiest things to win. Just bringing the case can help, especially when you're concerned about things like harassment through construction. Thanks to laws such as the certificate of no harassment, which can start building a case against your landlord and help prevent them from getting permits in the future. And then remember the fact that you're living in bad conditions, you're paying a whole lot of money for this apartment, and you're letting someone bully you out of living in good conditions, enjoying your apartment, having good health. And figure out what's the best strategy that you have to deal with other bullies in your life, because we all have them. We all have times when we're scared to talk to someone. Use those strategies when talking to your landlord too.
No, absolutely. And I know all too often in our office, we very much want to be encouraging tenants to understand what their rights are, to be talking to their neighbors, and to not let their fear stop them from asking for repairs that they desperately need. And keeping in mind that often it's the fear that's holding them back, and that often sometimes their management or building owners actually will take the steps that are necessary especially once they put their requests in writing, and they simply may not even know that conditions are as bad as if tenants have not raised it with the right people within the building. So again, we have so many questions. I'm just going to one last one, because I know we've received many different variations of this. What, if any, rights do tenants have to have their rent reduced if the Con Ed's turned off in their building? And I know that can often take 6, 7, 8 months, unfortunately, to sometimes get the situation remedied. Do tenants automatically have the right to deduct any amount from their rent, or is that something that just has to be negotiated?
There's no set amount that there's no nice chart. That would be nice to have one that says this kind of condition means this % off your rent. So it's difficult to predict. And in the end, if it's not negotiated and agreed on, a judge will make the decision, and they often go it's a kind of a subjective judgment. What tenants can do is withhold their rent, withhold all of the rent, set it all aside, right? Make sure that you have 100% of it, and then the landlord will come to you, and you can negotiate how much of it you will pay. Of course, the way that the landlord comes to you is they may bring a housing court case against you, and then you may be negotiating it or fighting it in the context of housing court.
So no, unfortunately, no easy solutions in situations like this. And so I know that Sateesh and Michael have been doing their absolute best to try to answer many of the questions that have come in through the Q&A throughout the event. And we're going to after tonight, when we send out a link to the video of tonight's event along with the PowerPoints, we will also try to include the Q&A that was shared. And again, I want to thank all of our presenters so much for joining us and answering both our live questions or questions via the chat. And again, this easily could have gone on for so many hours, and this just shows the need for more legal services, more tenant organizing, and the incredibly important now online tools that JustFix provides to enable tenants working with their neighbors to advocate for themselves. And so I thank you again for joining us tonight. Our next roundtable will be on Thursday, April 13th from 10 until 11:30 a.m. Senator Krueger absolutely should be back hosting that one, since the budget will be done, fingers crossed, by the end of this month. So we hope that all of you can join us, and again, details about our next event and a video of tonight's event will be emailed to everyone who RSVP'd either by the end of this week or early next week. But thank you, everybody, and have a lovely night.